Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to our weekly explained session. If you are liking these initiatives, do let us know by liking the video, by sharing your comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. The topic for today is the accidental launch of an Indian missile, most likely the BrahMos, which eventually landed in Pakistan. So in this session, we are going to explore this topic in complete detail, which will talk about the misfiring of this Indian missile towards Pakistan, and we are going to completely evaluate the implications of this incident on the India-Pakistan relationship. But first, let's begin with the context. On the 9th of March, a supersonic projectile reportedly took off somewhere in western India. It reached an altitude of 40,000 feet. It climbed at supersonic speeds to an altitude of 40,000 feet. And after around 3 or 4 minutes of flight, it took a turn towards Pakistan, towards the international border. It not only headed towards the Pakistani border, but it crossed the international boundary, breached Pakistani airspace, and then traveled another 124 kilometers into Pakistani territory. Eventually, this missile landed and crashed into a civilian property at a place known as Mian Channu. Following this incident, the very next day, Pakistan held a press release. The spokesperson of Pakistan Armed Forces, the DG of Inter-Services Public Relations, held a press conference and briefed the media and briefed the world that such an incident had taken place and sought a complete explanation from India. Because this was no ordinary rocket. It was not an ordinary missile which took off and hit Pakistan. It was a supersonic missile which was tracked by Pakistani air defense. It breached Pakistani airspace and traveled 124 kilometers inside Pakistani territory. Eventually, it crashed into a civilian property, but fortunately, there were no casualties. No one was injured, no one was killed. It was an empty property, but the property was damaged. The next day, that is 2 days after the incident, then India acknowledged that this incident had indeed taken place. India's Ministry of Defense finally responded after Pakistan's press conference and acknowledged that such an incident had indeed occurred. But again, fortunately for both the countries, this missile was not armed, meaning it had not been mated with a warhead. It didn't have an explosive warhead. Now, please remember, any supersonic cruise missile, right? It travels at tremendous speeds. It's virtually impossible to intercept them. If it were to be armed with a warhead, right, and if it were to strike a country like Pakistan, and if the missile took off from India, I'm sure you can imagine the consequences, right? So this is what happened between the 9th and the 11th of March. These incidents, these series of incidents that took place, they were unprecedented because there is no record in history of two nuclear armed rivals exchanging a missile between them, and that to an accidental launch, right? So let's see what Pakistan had to say about this incident, because it was Pakistan which first made the incident public. Pakistan claimed that its air defense had tracked this missile from launch to impact. According to Pakistani statements, the missile took off somewhere in western India, reportedly at the Sirsa Air Force Station in Haryana, which is a forward air base of the Indian Air Force. See, in this sector of Punjab, Haryana and Rajasthan, we have many frontline military bases, including air bases. They face the Pakistani border, and these are military bases which are constantly on high alert. So reportedly, from the Sirsa Air Force Station, the supersonic projectile took off, which was tracked by Pakistani air defense, and initially its path was towards the Mahajan testing range, which is in Rajasthan. India has a testing range at Rajasthan, the Mahajan testing range, and the missile was on course towards the Mahajan testing range. During flight, the speed of this missile was in the range of 2.5 to 3 Mach. It was traveling at 2.5 to 3 times the speed of sound. So clearly it was a supersonic projectile. Then all of a sudden, it takes a right turn, it veers off course, heads directly towards the Pakistani border, towards the international border. So now you can imagine the horror faced by the Pakistani authorities, right? If they indeed tracked the launch of the missile and if they saw the missile taking a turn towards the international border, that would have led the authorities to skip a heartbeat, right? It not only headed towards the Pakistani border, but it breached Pakistani airspace. And as you can see here, as depicted in the flight path, the missile traveled 124 kilometers inside Pakistani airspace. Finally hit a place known as Mia Chanu, located over here. This missile launch reportedly occurred at around 6:43 p.m. on the 9th of March, right? It crossed the border, the India-Pakistan border, at around 6:46 p.m., roughly after 3 minutes after launch. From here, it would travel for another 3 minutes odd, and finally it would make impact at around 6:50 p.m. So roughly, the overall course of this flight was 7 minutes. So these 7 minutes were filled with tension and horror for Pakistani authorities. Because from their perspective, this was nothing short of an act of war by India, right? A supersonic missile heading towards Pakistan. And they would have no idea that the missile was armed or not. They would not know whether the missile was carrying a warhead or not. So it was nothing short of an act of war, at least in these initial 7 minutes. So that is the reason why Pakistan went public with the event a day after. Fortunately, it didn't retaliate because Pakistan also saw that the damage caused was very minimal. It didn't hit any strategic target, right? It just struck a civilian property and there was no explosion because it wasn't carrying an explosive warhead. So the initial assessment would have led Pakistani authorities to realize that something has gone wrong. It was not a deliberate attack. So after they went public and after they sought explanation from India, 1 day later, that's 2 days after the incident, the Indian government finally acknowledged that this incident had indeed occurred. The Ministry of Defense issued a very partially worded statement, and India finally said that we express deep regret that such an incident took place, and India said that it was due to a technical malfunction because of which the missile had been accidentally fired. So India finally acknowledged that this was an accidental launch, occurred due to a technical malfunction. Following this, India said that it's ordering a high-level court of inquiry to thoroughly review, inspect and investigate as to what exactly happened, to review the chain of events that led to the accidental launch of a supersonic missile towards Pakistan, right? A few days later, number of questions were raised in the Indian media, even in the Indian Parliament, and Defense Minister Rajnath Singh informed the Indian Parliament that this was an accidental launch that occurred during routine maintenance and inspection. This was informed by the Defense Minister. He also said that following this incident, India is thoroughly investigating as to what went wrong. Because something clearly went wrong, either in the command and control structure of the launch sequence of a missile or in the standard established protocols, in the standard operating procedures or SOPs. So clearly something went wrong over here. So India said that we are reviewing all of this and a high-level inquiry has been ordered. But of course, Pakistan was not convinced by these arguments of India. Pakistan has even pushed India for a joint probe, a joint investigation. India has rejected any such possibility, but this is the statement that was put out by India. But this statement by India provides very little clarity on exactly what happened. Even Pakistan's press release doesn't provide all the details, right? Till now, both the governments haven't officially acknowledged as to which missile was it. Pakistan has just referred to it as a supersonic projectile. India has just acknowledged that there was an accidental launch of a missile. The missile itself has not been named by both the parties. But based on what Pakistan has revealed, right, based on what its air defense tracked, experts have figured out that it was most likely the BrahMos cruise missile of India, right? By looking at the characteristics of the flight path, it is widely expected that this was the BrahMos cruise missile. Because Pakistan has said that the missile climbed very quickly at supersonic speeds of 2.5 to 3 Mach to an altitude of 40,000 feet. It was cruising at supersonic speeds and it roughly covered a distance of around 300 kilometers, right? So all these parameters makes it quite easier to conclude that it was most likely the BrahMos. And also there are reports in the Indian media that the government of India has briefed reporters off the record, and it has been informed through sources that it was indeed the BrahMos which was misfired by India, which took the wrong route. So what really went down? What really happened? What could have been the consequences if things had escalated? What are the implications of this incident on the India-Pakistan relationship, right? And also, what is the BrahMos, right? What is the BrahMos missile? All these are some key issues that we need to cover from an examination perspective. Because see, here we are talking about two rival countries, two arch rivals who have fought multiple wars and conflicts. We are talking about nuclear armed rivals, and one of them is a state sponsorer of terror. Every now and then, there are terror attacks in India that are traced back to Pakistan. And quite often, India has put pressure on Pakistan, retaliated as well in some times by using military methods to punish Pakistan for its sponsorship of terrorism. So in such environment of heightened tensions, if there is an accidentally launched missile, a missile which went rogue or loose, right, and if it is misinterpreted by the other side, things could go horribly wrong for both the countries. It could eventually risk in a major escalation. It could result in a major escalation leading to a full-fledged conflict as well, and possibly with a nuclear scenario, right? Because see, the BrahMos which was fired, right, it is nuclear capable. It is capable of being mated with a nuclear warhead. And like I said, Pakistani air defense would have no way of knowing whether this missile was armed or not, right? If they were to assume the worst case scenario, they would assume that it is an armed missile and it is nuclear capable. What if it's a nuclear warhead, right? So Pakistan would be forced to respond even before this missile would make impact. Possibly there could have been a retaliatory strike, right? And what kind of strike would Pakistan carry out? That would have been a question. If it had used missiles to retaliate against India, if it had hit Indian targets, right, then India would also be forced to treat this as an act of war and carry out counterattacks. So things could have easily spiraled out of control. Mistakes and miscalculations would have happened on both the sides. That is why it's important to carefully examine this topic, right? To talk about the missile, the systems that we have put in place, the protocols we have regarding missile launches, informing the other side, right? And in case of such crisis situations, do we have any channels of communication to clarify what happened, right? And if we don't address these issues transparently, right, what are the implications for both the countries in the future? These are some key aspects that we need to explore in this discussion. So first, let's talk about the BrahMos cruise missile of India. Some of you might know that it's a supersonic cruise missile jointly developed by India and Russia, right? India's DRDO and its Russian counterpart. They have set up BrahMos Aerospace as a joint venture. So both the countries have jointly developed the BrahMos supersonic cruise missile. It's a medium-range missile powered by a ramjet engine. It's an air-breathing engine, right? A ramjet engine is an air-breathing engine that provides for very quick acceleration, and it's a supersonic missile that travels many times higher than the speed of sound. This supersonic missile can be launched from multiple platforms and multiple mediums. It can be launched from land through stationary launch pads or even through mobile moving launch pads. It can be launched from air through fighter jets, such as the Sukhoi 30 MKI of India, which has been customized to carry the BrahMos cruise missile. It can also be launched from the sea. In fact, the BrahMos was primarily developed as an anti-ship cruise missile. It can be launched from surface ships and as well as from underwater submarines. So it's a very versatile defense platform. It's a very versatile weapon, right? And its range was kept limited to 290 kilometers. This was primarily because there is a global export control regime known as the MTCR. It stands for Missile Technology Control Regime. MTCR stands for Missile Technology Control Regime. It's an export control regime. It basically controls the export of certain sensitive items, products and technologies. India until 2016 was not a member of this group. India was not a member of MTCR until 2016. So Russia had an obligation to not extend the range beyond 290 kilometers, because then Russia would have breached its MTCR obligations. Because under MTCR, it has been mandated that any missile or any unmanned aerial vehicle, if it can travel beyond 300 kilometers, if it has a range beyond 300 kilometers, and if it can carry a payload of more than 500 kilograms, then these missile and UAV technologies are classified as sensitive. There should be export controls on such technologies. So countries which possess these technologies, which are members of MTCR, they cannot export these technologies to others who are non-members of MTCR. So this was an obligation of Russia because India was not yet a member of MTCR, right? So Russia was not in a position to transfer a technology, a missile technology, with a range of more than 300 kilometers. So that's why the range was kept limited to 290 kilometers, and it was a jointly developed platform. BrahMos is said to be one of the world's fastest supersonic cruise missiles. It is said to be more faster and accurate than even the Tomahawk cruise missiles of the United States. BrahMos is also known for its great accuracy, right? So how can such a missile, a modern state-of-the-art missile, which is known for its accuracy, how could this be misfired? So what really went wrong, right? That is something we need to examine. Because imagine the consequences of this incident could have been very, very disastrous. We are already living in a very tense geopolitical world order, right? Clear divisions have emerged in the world in geopolitics. There are conflicts going on in different parts. Tensions are heightened between different countries. And that too between India and Pakistan, two arch rivals, right? Until recently, until just a few months back, we had heightened tensions in the relationship. Now imagine if this incident were to occur at that point, right? I'm talking about 2019, when the Pulwama terror attacks took place, right? Tensions were extremely high between the two sides. After that, India retaliated by carrying out the Balkot airstrikes. And even Pakistan retaliated, responded against the Balkot airstrikes. So in those heightened environment, let's say in those situations, if an accidental launch were to take place, chances are very high that the other side will assume that it is an attack. It's a full-fledged assault. It's an act of war. And Pakistan would have reserved the right to retaliate and respond against India. The question is, how would they respond, right? Would it be a full-fledged strike against India? Would it escalate into a bigger war or even reach the nuclear threshold, right? Or imagine if the same were to happen with India and China, because we have positioned BrahMos against China as well, and we currently are in the middle of a standoff, a military standoff in the Ladakh sector. So if an accidental launch were to take place from India and hit China, even then consequences will be severe. Because even China is going to interpret this as an act of war, right? This lapse on the Indian side, or even if it were to occur on the Pakistani side, it's a very serious lapse because the consequences can be disastrous, right? It might not just trigger a full-fledged war, but it could escalate to the nuclear level, where there could be a possible exchange of nuclear weapons. So this is the biggest concern. If Pakistan had assumed that it was under attack, it could have retaliated, right? Because like I said earlier, Pakistan had no way of knowing whether the missile was armed or unarmed. Chances are high, when tensions are extremely high between the two sides, that Pakistan would likely assume that the missile was armed. And what if they assume that it is armed with a nuclear warhead? Because there is no way for the air defense to pick up whether it's a nuclear warhead or a conventional warhead, right? Whether the missile is armed or not. So without this information, if Pakistan were to assume that it's under attack by India, it's an act of war, it could have possibly retaliated. So then what would India do, right? So just to think about it would send chills down your spine, because that is a worst case scenario for any nuclear armed country, not just for India, Pakistan. In fact, we have seen many such incidents, miscalculations being committed during the Cold War as well between the US and the Soviet Union. I'm going to come to that a little while later, but now let's further examine the consequences of such a lapse, right? Like I said, if there were to be a retaliation from the Pakistani side, you never know to what extent this could have escalated, right? It could have led to a limited exchange of missiles between the two countries. Possibly it could have escalated further based on suspicion and doubts and triggered a bigger war or a conflict, right? And if Pakistan were to assume the worst, right, if it were to assume that this was a nuclear armed missile headed towards Pakistan, most likely there would be a disproportionate response against India. There would have been a full blown out nuclear exchange, and it was one of the possibilities, the worst case scenarios. And the other concern is that you can't have such loose or rogue missiles, right, which are being misfired or accidentally launched. Because if you fire a missile in a particular airspace without sufficient warning and advisories, you are putting a number of civilian aircraft in the region at great risk. Because in both the Indian and Pakistani airspace, a number of domestic and international passenger flights would have been active at that point of time. If the missile were to collide with one of them, that would again be a humanitarian disaster, and India would have been held responsible for such an incident, right? So now the big question is, how can such a state-of-the-art missile, a sophisticated weapon, how can it misfire? How is it possible? How is it possible to have an accidental launch of this missile? So there are some serious questions that need to be answered, because these missiles, especially cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, they come with multiple fail-safe mechanisms. Because you're not just dealing with an ordinary rocket, it's not an ordinary missile. These are largely strategic weapons, right? They are capable of carrying nuclear warheads, and any nuclear armed country would have taken multiple steps to ensure that there is no accidental launch, there is no misfire. There would be multiple fail-safe mechanisms that would have been put in place. Because the launch of such a missile is not handled by one individual, by one soldier, by one commander, right? There would be an entire command and control structure which would have been created. India's nuclear arsenal has been placed under the command of the SFC, the Strategic Forces Command. It's a tri-service command which is responsible for operationalizing India's nuclear doctrine. If the Indian government, that is the Nuclear Command Authority headed by the PM, if it were ever to authorize a nuclear attack, those orders will be executed and implemented by the SFC, the Strategic Forces Command. So all the operational nuclear arsenal of India, warheads and missiles, they are under the command of the SFC. And as far as we know, as far as there is information in the public domain, India has not mated the delivery platforms with the warheads. They've been kept separate as a precautionary measure. The nuclear warheads, the missiles, and every other delivery system, they are demated. They're kept separate to prevent such accidents from happening. But coming to the missile itself, right? Even the launch of this missile involves a complex process. There is a series of steps that are involved. You have an entire launch sequence. It's not that you just press a button and the missile is launched, right? It's not that there is a short circuit or there is a manipulation of the code and the missile gets launched. There will be an entire launch sequence which would have been prescribed under a SOP, a standard operating procedure, right? There would be multiple officials involved in authorizing such a launch. And in the missile system itself, there would be multiple lock systems created. There would be mechanical locks and electronic locks as well, right? The right keys will have to be punched in. The codes, electronic codes will have to be punched in. The coordinates of the target will have to be punched in. And only after following the SOPs and after following the launch sequence will the missile be launched. So despite all these mechanisms in place, despite having so many redundancies in place, what went wrong? That is the question. How can such a sophisticated missile be accidentally fired, that too from India? Because India has an incredible track record with regard to its nuclear program, right? We have never had any such incident, and this actually puts a black spot on India's overall nuclear program as well. The other question is, generally such missiles come with a self-destruct mechanism, right? Even in flight, even after the missile has been launched, if you have to abort the mission, there will be a self-destruct sequence, right? If it was an accidental launch, possibly India could have self-destroyed the missile, even in flight. But according to several reports, BrahMos doesn't have a self-destruct mechanism. Ballistic missiles of India, like the Prithvi, the Agni series, right, which are primarily meant for carrying nuclear weapons, they have been provided with self-destruct mechanisms. According to publicly available information, what we can understand is that a cruise missile like BrahMos doesn't have a self-destruct mechanism, right? So after the accidental launch, there was no way for India to bring down the missile, right? It eventually had to take its course. So these are the different possibilities. These are the different risk factors that emerge from this particular incident. So there are a number of theories floating around. Many of them are conspiracy theories as well. Number of questions are being asked in India, in Pakistan, and around the world, that whether this was a missile test by India which went wrong, right? Or was India gauging and testing Pakistan's air defense response, right? So these theories are also floating around. But a look at the available evidence shows that these two are highly unlikely. Because see, generally India does not carry out a missile test towards the Pakistani border, nor towards the Chinese border. These are very sensitive borders, we know the implications, right? So Indian forces, even the DRDO and of course the SFC as well, they have no history of conducting a test of such a missile, a cruise or a ballistic missile, closer to the Pakistani or the Chinese border. It's too big a risk to take, because the other side could misinterpret that, right? So India has a standard practice of testing all missiles on the east coast. I'm sure you would have read in newspapers that in Odisha, we have the Balsore district, the coastal district, and off the coast of Balsore you have few islands, a group of islands named as the APJ Abdul Kalam Islands, right? The Abdul Kalam Islands. Over here, the DRDO has established an integrated test range to test India's missile systems. All the major missile platforms of India, the BrahMos, the Prithvi, Agni, and all the others are tested over here, because this is a safe zone. Here we have an open sea, right? There is no scope for suspicion here because it doesn't threaten any particular country. You have the open Bay of Bengal there, right? The missiles are usually launched towards the open Bay of Bengal, without threatening any country, and sufficient warnings, advisories are given before any such test, any such launch, right? You can't carry out such tests or launches in secret. It doesn't happen overnight. So this rules out the first theory. It was definitely not a missile test by India that went wrong. If it were to be a test, it would have been conducted on the east coast with sufficient notice and warning being given to all the stakeholders. Second option is also very, very unlikely. It's highly unlikely that India would take the risk of launching a cruise missile to just test Pakistan's air defense response. It's highly impossible for this to happen, because India would know the implications of this. If it were to go wrong, right, if the missile were to hit a strategic target, or if Pakistan construed this as an act of war and retaliated against India, we know the consequences, where it would head, right? So Pakistan being a nuclear armed country, it is simply unthinkable for anyone in the Indian government to even test the response of Pakistan through such an exercise. Neither would Pakistan ever attempt such an exercise against India, right? It is not rational, it is not logical. So this rules out both the theories. It's highly unlikely that it was a missile test which went wrong. It is highly unlikely that India was gauging or testing Pakistan's air defense response. So in short, this was an accident, right? Something went terribly wrong. Something went really, really wrong on the Indian side, and we have no answers as of now. So the government of India, the Defense Ministry, the Armed Forces, the DRDO, they all have a very, very big responsibility over here, especially after this incident. They need to be transparent about the court of inquiry, the investigation, and inform the public, the world, as to what really happened. Convey to Pakistan what went wrong, right? Because Pakistan did show the restraint. It did assess the situation, didn't press the panic button, retaliate against India. That would have triggered a horrific chain of events. So we have a responsibility to inform the public, the world, and Pakistan as to what really happened. If it was an accidental misfire, how did it take place? It shows there is something seriously wrong with the command control structure and with the SOPs, the standard operating procedures. Right? Fortunately, the Indian government has taken the right step. The defense minister as well, they've both informed that yes, we are reviewing, a high-level court of inquiry is taking place. We'll check what went wrong. We'll see where accountability has to be fixed. Because if it was a human error, then there has to be accountability. Heads will have to roll. Those are accountable, right? They will have to be punished as per law, because such grave human errors cannot be allowed in this scenario. If it was a technical error, India will have to figure out what went wrong and fix the issue. Otherwise, these incidents could recur, right? And no country would ever want to be in this position, neither India nor Pakistan. Because see, this incident in itself is going to have a huge impact on India. Let me explain why. Like I said earlier, this is an unprecedented event. There has never been a case where two nuclear armed countries have exchanged an accidental launch of missile between them. Not even US and Soviet Union. During the Cold War, there were many close events. The two countries did come close to a nuclear war. They did come close to miscalculations and mistakes. But there was never an actual exchange of a missile. This is the first time ever that a probable nuclear armed missile has been accidentally launched from one nuclear armed country towards another country. That's what makes this event unprecedented, right? That is why it is important for your exams as well. So here, India's credibility is at stake. Like I said earlier, India has an incredible track record of having a very clean nuclear weapons program, right? We have a great track record in nuclear non-proliferation. There has not been a single case of leakage of nuclear technology or material from India. India's nuclear program is widely respected around the world. That is the reason why most countries are working with India in the nuclear domain. Countries are supporting India to help India join the NSG, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which is another export control regime. So India's nuclear program, its missile program, has a lot of credibility. This has been built up over a period of time, right? We have put in place a nuclear doctrine. We have committed ourselves to a no first use policy, meaning we will never launch nuclear weapons in the first place, right? Our nuclear weapons are mainly for deterrence, to prevent a nuclear strike against India. It's for strategic purposes. It's purely for deterrence. If India were to be attacked first, right, then we guarantee a devastating second strike. This is the core pillar and the core principle of our nuclear doctrine. And to execute this, we have put in place a structure, a clear-cut structure has been put in place under the Nuclear Command Authority, which is headed by the Prime Minister. We have clearly spelled out to the world as to who takes the call, who takes the final decision, whether India would launch nuclear weapons. That button, the nuclear button, lies with the PM himself, with the civilian authorities, with the civilian government, right? The military doesn't have those powers. It's the Prime Minister of the country who makes the final decision with regard to India's nuclear war, if those options were ever to be considered, right? So we have a great track record. We have a credible nuclear doctrine and a structure in place. And just recently, we have been given recognition by many countries, and we are being admitted into export control regimes like MTCR, right? It's because of India's great track record that we are being admitted into these export control regimes. There's also Australia Group, Wassenaar Arrangement, right? India has recently become a member of all these export control regimes, and we are trying to become a member of NSG. So now, because of this incident, because of this misfire, and if India tries to cover up the incident, there will be a question mark on India's credibility, right? And especially hostile countries might misuse the opportunity, especially Pakistan and even China. Because China is blocking India's membership to NSG, right? China could use the incident to show that India is not responsible enough to be included in the export control regime. Or Pakistan might exaggerate the issue, bring it up at international platforms like UN, OIC and others, and accuse India of triggering tensions with possible nuclear consequences. Because see, generally it is believed that Pakistan is a high-risk country when it comes to nuclear weapons. every country, every major power, including US, European countries, and even China, the close ally of Pakistan, they're all concerned about the risk for nuclear weapons in Pakistan. Considering how weak the Pakistani state is, and considering the extent of spread of terrorism and radicalism in the country, and considering to what extent Pakistan's deep state, right, the deep state of Pakistan, its army and ISI, are involved with terror outfits, there is always a fear that Pakistan's nuclear weapons could fall into wrong hands. So that is a worst case scenario that every country has imagined, from India to US, from China to European countries. They've always seen Pakistan as a high risk country, and they've seen Pakistan as a country where such miscalculations and mistakes could occur that could potentially trigger a bigger conflict, right? So now Pakistan would try to latch on to the opportunity to change the narrative, right? Since the world has always blamed Pakistan, it might use the opportunity to question India's credibility and shift the blame towards India, shift the focus towards India. Pakistan could make an attempt to internationalize the issue, to point out that India is not responsible enough to handle nuclear weapons. It might keep bringing up concerns about India's missiles and nuclear weapons program, right? And with the backing of China, this could actually lead to significant international pressure on India. So that is a possibility, that is a possible impact as well. So we need to consider all these angles, all these possibilities, because in this domain you can't afford mistakes and miscalculations. The risk is too much, the cost would be too much, because any escalation, any war fought under such circumstances will quickly escalate, quickly go out of control, and it could be a conflict that would be fought under the nuclear threshold, under the nuclear hangover, right? You can't be sure that it wouldn't escalate to the nuclear level, because we have seen those events, we have seen those, the world has gone through these high risk, high tense moments during the Cold War era. There have been such miscalculations between US and Soviet Union as well during the Cold War. Let me just narrate a couple of incidents so that you can understand the gravity of the situation. There is one well-documented incident between US and Soviet Union during the Cold War, when reportedly the Soviet early warning systems picked up the launch of a rocket, an American rocket, and it was presumed that it was a ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead, right? The alarms went off and the Russian forces went on high alert, their nuclear strategic forces went on high alert, and it was later reported that Soviet Union President, Mr. Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, had even picked up the nuclear football, which contains the nuclear codes, to possibly consider launching a counter-strike against the US. Later it turned out that it was a false alarm. It was just an American rocket launching a satellite into orbit. It was a big miscalculation on the Soviet side, and if they had continued with the assumption that it was a nuclear strike coming from US, and if they had retaliated, right, things would have been very, very different for the world. There was one more incident involving the two countries again during the Cold War. According to this report, according to this incident, the National Security Advisor of the US, the NSA of the United States, he was woken up in the middle of the night during the Cold War period, and he was warned that 2,000 nuclear warheads have been launched by Soviet Union, right? He was given an alarming piece of intelligence that 2,000 nuclear ballistic missiles are headed towards the US and they have been launched. Immediately, the NSA picks up the phone, calls the US president, and advises him to launch a counter-attack, a massive counter-attack against Soviet Union. But fortunately, calmer heads prevailed, and later it was seen that this was again a false piece of information. The alarm systems went wrong, a computer chip had malfunctioned, right? Human and technical errors had led to this false alarm that 2,000 missiles were headed towards the United States, right? Now imagine if things had gone the other way around. Imagine if a calm application of mind wasn't there on both the sides in both these incidents. Most likely there would have been a nuclear exchange, right, leading to complete devastation. Now this lesson from the Cold War has direct implications for India and Pakistan, considering the incident that has happened. See, US and Soviet Union, at least, they had a good 30 minutes to think and respond. because of the distance between the two countries, right? Any ballistic missile would take roughly around half an hour to strike each other. So they had a 30-minute window before they could detect, track and intercept or launch counterattacks. In the case of India-Pakistan, we don't have this luxury, right? We are neighbors. We are neighboring countries that share a land border and a maritime border. Because of our geographical proximity, the response time is very, very short. It is under 10 minutes for the Indian leadership and the Pakistani leadership to determine whether to launch a nuclear strike, right? Now, as you saw in the flight path of this missile, right, the time it took to strike Pakistan was around 7 minutes. Maybe let's say we take another further location, the time duration is max 9 to 10 minutes. So once Pakistani air defense or Indian air defense detects the launch of any such missile, the time they get to respond to not just intercept the missile but to launch a bigger counter attack is around 10 minutes. So in such heightened tense situations and environments, chances are very high that mistakes will be made, miscalculations will be made, right? And we simply can't afford them. We do have some safety mechanisms. There are protocols in place, but they are not sufficient, right? This is what India, Pakistan need to learn from this incident, and this is where we need to work on. This is where we need to focus on. We need to work on implementing better safety mechanisms and protocols to prevent an escalation from such accidental misfires. Such an incident could happen in the future as well, right? So we need to put in place sufficient mechanisms through protocols and agreements and safety mechanisms so that there is a better communication between the two sides if something were to go wrong, okay? So since we are talking about protocols and agreements related to missiles, nuclear program of India, Pakistan, there are two such agreements and protocols we already have, okay? One is the pre-notification of flight testing of ballistic missiles agreement, which was signed between two countries in the year 2005. This missile mandates both the countries to issue a prior notification of any upcoming test of a ballistic missile. Is that clear? They have to mandatorily provide for advance notification to each other to prevent any mistakes or miscalculations. If they are launching a ballistic missile, testing it, the prior warning advance notice has to be provided. This notice should also be issued to aircrafts, that is to civilian air traffic, and to seafarers as well. Technically, these notices are known as NOTAM, Notice to Air Missions or Notice to Airmen, and NAV area or Navigational Warning. These are prior warnings given to civilian aircraft, airlines, and even to seafarers to stay away from the testing zone. During any such test, the test zone would be clearly marked out. The notice will clearly tell which is the test area, the test zone, and all aircrafts and ships are supposed to stay away from the test zone, right? So this is a mandatory provision under this agreement, bilateral agreement between India and Pakistan. The agreement also says that the country which is testing the missile should ensure that the launch site, the test site, is not within 40 kilometers and the planned impact area should not be within 75 kilometers of either the international boundary or the line of control. Okay? This is again to avoid any miscalculation, to avoid any mistakes being made by both the sides. They have to carry the test as far away as possible from the international border or the LOC. The planned trajectory, the trajectory of the test flight, should not cross the IB and the LOC. I hope you know that between India and Pakistan, we have a stretch of the border known as the IB or the international border. This is the settled, resolved boundary we have, which stretches from Gujarat to Rajasthan to Punjab, right, all the way up to Jammu. This stretch of the border which is settled, which is not disputed, is called the IB or the international border. The disputed boundary in Kashmir is the LOC, the line of control. So in and around these areas, tests are prohibited. The missile test cannot take this trajectory. They have to avoid these areas. The testing country must notify the other nation at least 3 days prior. A 3 days advance notice has to be given about the commencement of a 5-day launch window. So meaning the notice has to be given 8 days before the test. There should be a 5-day launch window for the launch sequence, and 3 days prior to that, the notice has to be given to the other country. And this prior notification should be conveyed through diplomatic channels. Through the respective foreign ministries and high commissions, this pre-notification has to be exchanged as per the format and the terms of this agreement. So this is one precautionary measure India Pakistan have put in place to avoid any miscalculations. But as you can see, this particular agreement covers only ballistic missiles. Is that clear? It does not cover a cruise missile like the BrahMos. Now this is a lesson we need to learn, both India and Pakistan. We should consider including cruise missiles as well under the agreement following what happened. Because even Pakistan possesses cruise missiles which are nuclear capable. We have BrahMos. So it is better for both the countries to include cruise missiles under the agreement as well, so that any mistakes or miscalculations can be avoided. So the existing agreement is not sufficient. It doesn't cover all the threats. Another agreement is the agreement on prohibition of attack against nuclear installations and facilities. This key agreement was signed between India and Pakistan in the year 1988 by the then Rajiv Gandhi government, and it came into force in the year 1991. Under the agreement, India and Pakistan have to inform each other of their nuclear installations and facilities which are covered under the agreement on the 1st of every year, on the 1st of January of every year. So every year on the 1st of Jan, the officials of both the sides, they meet and they exchange a list of their nuclear installations and facilities which are protected under the agreement. So both the countries have an obligation here to not target or attack these nuclear facilities and installations which have been listed out by the other country. This is another fail-safe mechanism to prevent a launch of an attack against any sensitive nuclear facility or nuclear installation, right? The idea is to prevent any unnecessary escalation or any unnecessary nuclear accident. But again, as you can see, this is not specific to the incident that occurred recently. It doesn't prevent an accidental launch. It doesn't provide for any channel of communication if there were to be an accidental strike, right, using such missiles or nuclear weapons. So again, this existing agreement and protocol is not sufficient, right? This is the reason why both the countries have to draw an important lesson from what happened, right? It's an opportunity for India, Pakistan to review and identify as to what went wrong in this particular incident. It's not just for India, even for Pakistan. They have to thoroughly review their SOPs, their standard operating procedures. They have to review the command control structures which initiate the launch sequence, identify where mistakes were made, and accountability has to be fixed. This is all the more important for Pakistan to do because Pakistan has not been very transparent about its nuclear program. Pakistan has shown very little transparency, right? It doesn't have a nuclear doctrine like India. It hasn't clearly established a nuclear structure like India, right? It's not known whether who takes the call to launch nuclear attacks in Pakistan. Is it the Pakistani Prime Minister or the army chief? There are reports from Pakistan as well which indicate that Pakistan has developed tactical battlefield nuclear weapons, that is smaller warheads which can be used in a battlefield. Generally, nuclear weapons, the larger warheads, they are strategic weapons. They are meant for deterrence, to deter the other country from attacking first. But Pakistan has reportedly developed tactical battlefield weapons which can actually be used in a war against the enemy forces. Publicly, as far as we know, India doesn't possess tactical nuclear warheads which can be used in a battlefield. And there are reports in Pakistan that these tactical nuclear warheads, right, the smaller nuclear warheads, they have been placed under the control of local commanders during times of crisis, meaning they can take a call in an adverse situation to use or deploy nuclear weapons in the battlefield, right? So this being the case, and since Pakistan is not transparent about its nuclear doctrine and structure, since Pakistan has a greater risk of committing mistakes in the nuclear domain, and since there is a risk of Pakistan's weapons falling into wrong hands, it's of utmost importance for both countries to review their protocols, to review their SOPs and command control structure, right? They also should put in place multiple redundancies in their systems. There has to be multiple checks and balances and redundancies which can ensure that there are foolproof mechanisms, fail-safe mechanisms. There should be multiple layers of of foolproof fail-safe mechanisms which can prevent any such accidental strikes, right? There should be no scope for human error or technical error which could eventually result in a bigger launch or a bigger strike. This is what the two countries have to learn, and to prevent such incidents from happening, and if it were to happen, to prevent escalation into a war, into a nuclear conflict, what we need is better channels of communication. Both the sides, they have to set up a dedicated channel of communication at the highest levels of the government and the armed forces to clarify each other's position. Now see, we already have a hotline between the DGMOs of both the sides. The Director General of Military Operations of both countries, they have an established hotline to talk to each other to prevent any such misunderstandings, to prevent any unnecessary escalation. But what is shocking is that the Indian side did not make use of this facility. Even after 48 hours after the incident, right, India did not reach out to Pakistan through back channels, through secretly or through such hotlines, through such established communication channels, and we didn't inform Pakistan that it was an accidental launch. Now, how will Pakistan know it was accidental? How will Pakistan know that it didn't have a warhead, right? As soon as the launch happened, ideally, India should have reached out, or at least we don't know that in the public domain. Ideally, India should have reached out to Pakistan through the hotline or at the highest levels of the government and informed Pakistan that there is a missile headed towards the country, right? We had 7 minutes. It's plenty of time to have warned Pakistan that it is an accidental launch. It wasn't meant to happen, right? Then we could have prevented any escalation. But fortunately, in this case, Pakistan took a very sane decision, right? Fortunately, both the sides, they didn't take the matter further, and that is what prevented a bigger crisis from occurring. So we need established channels of communication at the highest levels to communicate any such incidents, to inform the other side that this is an accident, it's a mistake, or to calm tensions, to guarantee the other side that we are not escalating, right? We are not looking at war, we are not looking at a nuclear strike. So such assurances are very, very crucial during periods of heightened tensions, and especially when such mistakes happen. So there is a need for a mechanism to reduce the risk. Between India and Pakistan, there is a very high degree of risk of an accidental strike taking place. So we need to put in place a risk reduction mechanism, and we have to revive the nuclear confidence building measures that have stalled from many years. Between India and Pakistan, there is an arrangement to install CBMs or confidence building measures in the nuclear domain. Through regular talks, regular interactions, regular exchange of information, both sides had made an attempt a few years back to build confidence in each other that there won't be an unnecessary escalation, there won't be an accidental strike, there won't be any miscalculations. But due to the state of relations from the last 4 to 6 years, these nuclear confidence building measures have been stalled. They have been put to a halt, and the two sides haven't taken forward any such interaction, right? So it's time to revive them, because even during the Cold War, US and Soviet Union, they had such measures in place. They had established dedicated hotlines, channels of communication to convey to each other at the highest levels that we are not attacking you, that you are not under attack. If there is an accidental launch, it would be informed immediately, right? If there is an unnecessary escalation happening, or if there is a miscalculation taking place, the other side would warn and tell them that we are not escalating, right? It would assure the other side and help in de-escalation. So such risk reducing mechanisms were there between US and Soviet Union, right? They had put in place a nuclear CBM mechanism through which they would exchange these talks and these information. Between India and Pakistan, we don't have it. So there is a urgent need to put in place these mechanisms, right? This is the two-step strategy that both India and Pakistan should follow following this incident. One, we have to thoroughly review our SOPs, protocols, and command and control structure, right? Identify where things went wrong and put in place accountability. Be transparent about the programs, the structures, ensure that there are fail-safe mechanisms, ensure that human and technical errors don't result in these incidents. But at the end of the day, nothing is foolproof, right? Nothing is perfect. Systems could fail, human error could happen. And if another accident were to happen like this, another misfire, mislaunch, then we should have mechanisms to convey this to the other side. We should have mechanisms to assure the other side that this was not an attack. It is an accident. right? So de-escalation mechanisms, channel of communication should be available. This is the lesson that we need to take away, and that is something both India, Pakistan should try and implement. So with this, I would like to conclude the session, and we have covered not just the incident and the details of the incident, but we have explored the implications of this incident for the broader India-Pakistan relations, especially under the nuclear threshold, right? So with this, I would like to conclude the session. If you have felt these initiatives to be useful, do let us know by liking the video, share your comments, and do subscribe to the channel. And if you have any suggestions for the topics for next week's explained session, do let us know in the comment section as well. So that is for today. Thanks for watching. Good night.